We just started, so you're live.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jovanovic. I'm a second-year PhD student at Aarhus University in Denmark, and I'm also part of the Einstein project. And it's my great pleasure to be here today, opening up this first Einstein webinar with 3 wonderful speakers. And I'm going to present them in a moment. But before we start, I would like to spend a few words on what is actually Einstein. And as you can see from here, Einstein is an acronym of a quite long name, but more importantly is a consortium of almost 30 members between academia and industry. And 15 PhD students are currently enrolled in 7 different universities. But among the industry partners, we have also the Hyperledger Foundations, which is why they're co-hosting the webinar together with us today. And if you want to know more about the project, I believe Vivian is going to share the project website shortly in the chat. So, speaking of collaborations between different institutions, the organization of this webinar wouldn't have been possible without the contribution of other 4 PhD students, whose names are Christina, Nicola, Vivian, Chiara, and of course, David from the Hyperledger Foundation. So thanks to all of them. And before we start, I would just like to spend a few words on the agenda of today's webinar. So today we are going to have 3 presentations, each lasting 15 minutes, followed by a 5-minute buffer for any question that you might have or you might come up right after the talk. Eventually, at the end, we're going to have also 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you want to take some more time to think about or to come up with some questions, you have time also toward the end. And I think we are ready to start with Marin. So Marin is an associate professor at Copenhagen Business School, and is also a visiting scholar at Luleå University in Sweden, University of Technology in Sweden. His main research interests concern the digital transformation in different sectors, manufacturing, maritime, and healthcare, but also the rise of platform ecosystems in the B2B context, which is why he's here with us today. And finally, Marin administers also a blog on industry platforms research, and I'm going to share it in the chat because I think it might be interesting for many of you in the audience. So I think that's it on my side. So Marin, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. That's it. All right. Perfect. So thank you very much for invitation. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with Tomasz Sedej, who is a member of the Hyperledger. He joined Hyperledger after finishing his PhD here at CBS. So we've been working on blockchain-based platform research for a while. Actually, that was his main focus of the PhD. So that's how I got actually engaged with blockchain-based platforms specifically. However, I've been interested in industry platforms for a while, and I will tell you how I arrived to industry platforms specifically. So my main interest during my PhD was servitization, right? That's the ugly word, servitization. So focusing increasingly on services, because competing with products became increasingly difficult, right? Making a distinction on a product basis was difficult for companies, right? So they were trying to bundle product services, but then after a service layer, right, the digitalization came as another layer, right? So it became really interesting to see how now companies are combining product, service, but also a digital layer, and digital layer requires a platform, right? Always. So that's kind of how I arrived to industry platforms specifically, right? Through the literature of servitization and now increasingly a digital servitization, right? It's a still phenomena, right? That's kind of the problem with that literature, because there is no theory of servitization in the digital. So we are looking for a different theoretical homes when we kind of write a paper, because that's still a phenomena, right? So as paper, this is a slide about me. Yeah, I'm actually a computer scientist, or information systems was my major. And then I escaped from computer science to business, right? Now, management scholars are running to digital, and I actually escaped from the digital. So it's very interesting to me to see how this evolved. I had some consulting experience, also some industry experience in Italy, and also in a Molson course, mostly like a global brewing company. And then, yeah, today I also consult the Danish government since COVID crisis. I've been helping them on increasing the testing capacity, right? So more or less, this is my profile. Cambridge, I've been at Cambridge as well, at Institute for Manufacturing. So I've been working with Professor Neely for a while on servitization as well, right? So now let's get to platform ecosystem. So I've been told to focus a bit more on theory, because I think other speakers will show plenty of empirical examples, right? So I was thinking what would be the most useful for the audience to kind of digest this literature a bit better, or if they already know how the literature is structured, maybe what would be my contribution you know, to you in that sense, right? So I was thinking what would be the key concepts and key papers, and I will try to build a narrative from there. So the Adner, right, 2017, Journal of Management, definitely. So alignment of structure. So we usually have a multilateral set of partners, right? They're different in size and interest, and we will try to ensure alignment structures. So this is an important a construct when we talk about ecosystems, right? And the focal value proposition, or like the single point of, you know, convergence of different partners, is also increasingly studied, right? How we ensure that this multilateral set of partners, they all have a common goal, or a common, or contribute in their way to the common focal value proposition. Then, of course, we have Jake White's paper when they said, well, it's not all partners that are all complementars. Not all partners are complementars. So he has a notion that, you know, the generic complementarities, they're not really a complementer. So when we talk about complementarities, we talk about non-generic complementarity, and that's kind of important. It goes from the modularity literature. It can go from generic to super generic, super modular complementarities. Another important thing that I really highlight to my students, it's that you know, in a typical value chain, because I teach supply chain management, you know, typical supply chain, we are usually, you know, hierarchically controlled. And in this context of ecosystem, we have a notion of where partners are they're not hierarchically controlled, which is very important, right? So they are interdependent, but they are interrelated, right? So this is something just to set the base of what the ecosystem is. So now when we discuss a platform ecosystem, right? So there is some platform architecture, right? When we say architecture, we think about technology, right? The modules, like technological modules. And on top of that, this platform architecture is actually an enabling layer. You can say, Konstantinides and other scholars would say, or Tilson, right? They would say it's a digital infrastructure, depending which perspective you take, but the platform architecture is the enabling layer, right? And on top of it, we would have an ecosystem, right? So a very important paper also recent, Kretschmer, about platform ecosystem as meta-organizations, very important paper. I think you should all read it if you're interested in this, right? So, and then the last, but probably the most important concept is the governance, right? And we will talk a bit more about the governance of such platforms. The platform governance is really important. So what I did in my Technovation paper, which was published like 2 years ago now, I think we got the volume 2022, but it's been published for a while. We made a Frankenstein definition, which combines all possible smart definitions. So we said that platform ecosystem is a meta-organizational form, and we have enabling platform architecture, right? It's supported by a set of governance mechanisms, and governance mechanisms are necessary to cooperate, coordinate, integrate diverse set of partners, right? Diverse actors, activities, interfaces. And what's the point? The point is to increase the platform value through customized platform services. So that's towards the end, it gets very busy, but that's kind of how we defined it. When it comes to platform value, my colleague from CBS, Carmelo Senamo, has a really important paper as well in Academy of Management Perspectives. So I also encourage you to check how Carmelo conceptualized the platform value in terms of platform identity and the platform scope. So this is also something from my side. So if these are the concepts right now that kind of I presented here, the most important concepts that you can engage in your research, but also that are interesting when we discuss the platforms, both empirically and theoretically. The TradeLens is a blockchain-based platform that we studied. Unfortunately, it failed after, or it got discontinued after we published the paper. It would be much better to have a case of, that it was discontinued before we published the paper, but still we are still fine with what we presented in that paper. And I will present a few learnings that we got from that paper, and then across this concept that I introduced now, right? So I'm trying to be systematic to some extent. So this is now a TradeLens conceptualized. Like, we have a platform architecture, right? The IT infrastructure on the bottom. It's based on the blockchain network. I will not go into details. We interviewed both representatives of IBM and TradeLens, and also Maersk initially. So it was a qualitative paper. And the platform architecture on this graph represents, right, the bottom side. It's, of course, utilizes the APIs. The APIs were something, what I would say, semi-open. They were open to most of the complement or startups or interested party willing to collaborate with them, but they were not, I would say, completely open. And then marketplace is how we basically build an ecosystem, right, on top of it. So the third-party applications is actually the essence of that ecosystem. However, in most of the industrial setting, the platform sponsor would develop initial set of functionalities and applications, and then they would represent the core. The similar cases with Cognify that I also study, developed by Kongsberg Maritime, or other platforms in the industrial mining or other sectors, right? So basically, the platform sponsor would develop a few apps, and then they would invite also other complementers to build more applications on top. What was the key point, the key value proposition of the whole initiative is that it was industry-wide platform. There is a distinction, at least in my mind, when we talk about industry and industrial. So industry-wide meaning like end-to-end industry integration. So TradeLens try to do end-to-end industry integration. So try to follow the shipment from end to end, and all the actors involved in that shipment, right? When we talk, or at least when I talk about industrial platform, we think about maybe a mining site, and then we would try to connect different, let's say, provider like Caterpillar, Komatsu, Volvo around the mine, and then still open the APIs to, let's say, drone manufacturers like DJI and other to provide some complementary services on top, right? But it's not, the aim is not to connect the industry as a whole. It's more about the focal solution or an application, right? So these are the key actors TradeLens was targeting, like authorities, screening shipment, right? Of course, ocean carriers, ports and terminal, a lot of potential savings for this area. And then exporters, importers, freight forwarders, definitely a lot of potential benefits for them as well, right? So if there is like three important distinction in platform ecosystem research, again, I'm nailing over and over. One is a platform architecture or just architecture. The other one is community, right? So if you have an ecosystem, you need to have a community of different firms, big and small. Heterogeneity is high, but it's a community, right? And we can have different techniques, how we can engage that community, how we can make sure that the community is generating value for us. And the third one is a governance, right? So we need a proper governance to connect basically all together, right? So we have architecture, community, and governance. At least in my head, this is the most important ones. And you will see what other scholars think, how we can extend even these three key concepts in the context of generativity. So still, I think we are playing with these three key concepts: the governance, the community, and the architecture. All right. So I'm careful about the time, and then maybe what I will present some of the lessons learned from our case of a blockchain application in the global supply chain. But I think when it comes to the blockchain and in general with the data, analytics in general and the data-driven operations, it is important to kind of have a step back and ask yourself what problem we are trying to solve, right, in the first place. And I think this is in general problem with the blockchain, not technology per se, but with the many applications that are building on top of blockchain, right? What we are trying to solve, and whether blockchain is the right technology to address that problem, right? I will leave this to you, but I think you know what I'm aiming for in light of the trade lens overall, and I think you can think about different platforms. Like, I think we need to be very critical when it comes to the core value of the platforms that are based on the blockchain, and ask ourselves whether the blockchain is really a solution, a trust-building mechanism, and whether it is necessary to achieve what we want to achieve, right? I'm not saying blockchain is not the right solution. I think it's an amazing solution. I think we just need to be very critical about it. So the inefficiencies in the shipping industries are just massive, right? It's a massive inefficiencies in the shipping. So it's really old, very traditional, outdated industry, very conservative industry. The systems are introduced over many years by different actors for different purpose. It's not a secret that at Maersk, like, there are so many different platforms that even like the employees at Maersk, they don't know what platforms to use, right? So, and this is the same across the shipping carriers, right? So because it's such a big a system, and that is very difficult to change. That it is changing, but slowly. So, you know, blockchain was supposed to be a right solution for it, right? So because this is what we have a technology that can address problems like, you know, different perspectives on the transaction status, right? So this is exactly what we are trying to achieve. Well, then, you know, the big companies are usually, you know, slow and you know, outdated. The technology is a space where smaller companies are much more competitive, right? So it was also an interesting interaction when different industries are converging, like the old industry, shipping industry. You can think about different industries that are really traditional. They are converging with the startup entrepreneurial space, and that's also what is happening in this sector. So we've seen a lot of that. So digitizing records and handling data security with high precision. So basically, that was the kind of selling point. So we want to digitize all the record, and we want to handle security with high precision. So when I discussed with the IBM guys, so they told me, Marin, listen, the key point in our solution was that basically you could share sensitive data without seeing what is in the block, basically. So that was kind of the value proposition. So kind of really having access to data without seeing the data, and that's the core of the solution, and definitely reducing transaction costs and smart contracts and all other benefits would be part of the ecosystem, right? And this is something we unfortunately the platform didn't live long enough to see the smart contracts and the flourishing the ecosystem on top of it, right? But we may see it in different sectors where the smart contracts and different startups, complementors, will develop a solution to you know, self-automate, self-execute a contract in a specific context, and have a firm and have a you know, legit be a legit complementer around it. So that's the basis was this seamless integration, transparency, and then layer of data was promising like an amazing ecosystem on top, right? So once we have this basic platform architecture established, the data layer was extremely promising to unlock the whole ecosystem of application across the end-to-end, shipping global supply chain, right? So that was the idea. Now the governance was, the governance is the key issue in all platforms, and then specifically in industry-wide platforms, because the neutrality of the platform is very important, right? So you know that like the Maersk is one of the competitors in the industry, and I think regardless of trying to kind of make a distinction and from the original idea, it was really difficult for other partners to just accept it, or maybe to, I would say from the other perspective, to gain traction, right, to adopt the platform, right? So the notion of in the context where data is extremely valuable and data is extremely sensitive, the neutrality of the platform sponsor is almost an imperative, right? So when data is so valuable, it is just impossible. Maybe in some other contexts where data is not so valuable, actors, complementors, partners are fine with having different different power position from the platform sponsor or platform owner, as it's written in the literature. In this kind of context, that was a big problem, and it was impacting the industry-wide adoption. So now, what is the governance? And then what we distinguish three type of governance. The first one was the on-chain, like on the technology, on the block chain technology governance. The second one was off-chain, and we said it's kind of more strategic governance, like how we were set the let's say hypothetically revenue models, or how we will split appropriate value, or how we will govern our partners, set interorganizational relationships. And the third one was just interoperability. It's kind of a bit of both, but we believed it's so important, the interoperability, that it requires a governance on its own. Like, so the third type, we said it's interoperability governance, right? So in that sense, one more important takeaway that it's not specifically from TradeLens but from other platforms that I studied, is that the B2B platforms are very different from B2C, and the main distinction is that onboarding is difficult. Onboarding is 101. Onboarding is long, and self-selection is very hard to be on a B2B platform. So complementors or partners cannot be added based on self-selection. So I am just joining the platform. No. So we need an onboarding process. And we see across the industry, specifically Ericsson has been doing quite good in making a system to ensure that the partners can onboard, but at the same time have scale, right? Because it's impossible to change the industry if you have to, as a platform sponsor or a key partner, to onboard each and every partner individually. So one of the last points is the interoperability. The digital standardization is the key. And I've been involved with DCSA, who was developing the standards for this industry, and they played a really important role and will play important role in the future for industries like this that are very very sensitive about the data. Last slide for scholars, young scholars. I will share what I do currently. It's a generativity. I work on generative ecosystems. And again, as you can see, the generative architecture, governance, and community are the key constructs that other scholars picked. They just added generativity on top. Please read the paper, and you will see how combination of these three are unlocking combinatorial potential, right? So what we have to do with the governance, architecture, and community to really unlock the combinatorial innovations. So that's all from my side. I think I'm already stepping on other presenters' time, but this is all for now.
Great, thanks, Marin, for the presentation. I think many of the things and terms that you have mentioned so far can speak to both Daniela and Doug. For example, community, architecture, governance. I think all these terms are very dear to the Hyperledger Foundation or the Linux Foundation or community at large. So I think we don't have, unfortunately, time now for questions, but if you have, we can get back to it during the final Q&A. So now I'm gonna introduce the next speaker, who is Daniela Barbosa. Yeah, perfect. You're already sharing the screen. And Daniela serves as a General Manager, Blockchain and Identity at the Linux Foundation and as Executive Director of Hyperledger Foundation. Daniela has more than 20 years of enterprise technology experience, as she actually started her career at Dow Jones, but one of her passions, I would say, is related to the concept of digital identity and data portability, which is why she first got involved in the early Web 2.0 community, and then she got closer to the blockchain space some time ago. So I think after this theoretical perspective, now we are going much more into the technicalities to some extent, and then the business perspective. So Daniela, if you're ready, over to you.
Well, Gian Lorenzo, thank you for inviting us and for coordinating with Einstein. We're very excited in our collaboration with you and the rest of the organization there as we get closer to the academic community working on blockchain. And if you think about, what our community at the Hyperledger Foundation, but the greater enterprise blockchain community, the lessons learned that we also have had, and Marin spoke to some of those, it's amazing. From a trade finance perspective, obviously in supply chain, it is about digital transformation, and it's a problem that, a lot of these organizations are still not ready for it, but also it's a fantastic opportunity. I love the framing that Marin started with about architecture, community, and governance. If you think about open source, and why open source, I think it really focuses, and I'm going to focus on that today. For those of you who might be new to the Hyperledger Foundation, it is a foundation that since 2015, early on in the blockchain days, has really been focused around building cross-industry communities that are working on blockchain and blockchain-related technologies. And I'll mention quite a few about those today. But I want to talk first about the importance of open source and the importance of, if you are building global networks and communities, much like Marin talked about, and Doug will talk about that Circulor is building, why open source is so critical. The Hyperledger Foundation is hosted by the Linux Foundation. We're one of hundreds of different projects within the Linux Foundation. And the goal of the Linux Foundation is really just to create and enable open source collaboration with developers and users of open source code bases. Let me just pull this out of here. Sorry, I have my video on top of me. We are a nonprofit organization that for the last 20 years has really been building some of the most important open source critical projects in the world. These are just some of the logos by category, but if you think about the things you touch day in, day out from a technology perspective, whether in your enterprise use, employment in the companies that you work with, or in any of your interactions with your phones, with social media applications, most likely even films, watching, one of your favorite films or Netflix series, most likely there is open source software that has come that is hosted, and the community is hosted here at the Linux Foundation. And obviously blockchain and blockchain related technologies are certainly one of them. as well. The importance of that is that we continue to be a place where there's free exchange of data, code, and innovation. We have over 2,500 companies that support the Linux Foundation, and it's hundreds of different open source projects. But it's really about being, once again, that part of modern technology and how technology is being used, and creating a place for companies, individuals, and very importantly, more and more government organizations to come in to not only use the code, but contribute to the code to build what we here at the Hyperledger Foundation, we call, building better together. But how do we collaborate on the things that are critical for the future of financial services infrastructure, of supply chains, of healthcare systems, that we do that in the open and collaboratively using open source. When you think about open source code, a lot of people know open source code. You go to a GitHub repository, you see your code, you're able to look at it. Some you're able to contribute, or you make bug requests, or submit a bug, or make a request of that code projects. But there's really a lot of other things that go on behind the scene to make an open source community like the Hyperledger Foundation and many of the other ones here at the Linux Foundation really, really successful, and really being able to deliver what we call enterprise-grade code and communities to these multiple industry use cases that we'll talk about today. The Linux Foundation, and this obviously includes a lot of what the Hyperledger Foundation does for our projects and our communities, does a lot of support and resources of the developers and the communities that the developers are part of, really focusing on making sure that there's neutral management of the code. So meaning that there's not one vendor to rule them all that controls the code. But also ways to make sure that there's training and certifications, so that if you want to be a certified Hyperledger Fabric certified developer, for example, there is a place for you to go to. And if you want to hire someone that, for example, is a Hyperledger certified service provider, there is a program for that for you to use as well. And this is all about the maturity of the code that we go through. So the Linux Foundation delivers a wide range of services to really make sure that open source and the communities are able to be used and adopted in many of these very large organizations. And the Hyperledger Foundation is part of it. There is no doubt that open source is eating the world. 78% of companies are already using open source, and the number is probably even higher than that. And 63% are participating, they're contributing, they're participating in an open source community, whether it be something like the Linux Foundation or other projects that are out there. And it doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. As you can see, the number of libraries that have been open source since 2012 continue to grow. And I think we'll see more and more of that. And certainly in the blockchain and digital identity space, open source has really won the game. It is the only way that code can be implemented and should be implemented, in our opinion, into these systems as well. And what happens is, when open source does is it's going to enable companies to really reshape the industry value chain in both ways that are neutral. So creating these industry platforms like Marin was talking about, and we'll hear Doug talking about as well with Circulor, that are industry platforms that multiple participants are a part of, right? That community aspect of creating these platforms, and also that are able to drive the competitive goals, right? Very often, Marin talked about this, you have competitors that actually live in these networks or live in these open source communities. And how do you make sure that there's also an ability to drive that competitive stakeholdership of the solutions and the things that you offer. So all open source, and for the last 20 years, as I mentioned, the Linux Foundation has been doing this, but open source in general is a place for these types of platforms and solutions to build. Here at the Hyperledger Foundation, our community is 100% open, meaning that is never pay to play. You can participate in any of the communities, any of the project communities, the special interest groups, the meetups, everything like you're contributing to today and participating today is open. And that's really, really important for us. And we're very interested in the developers. We are a developer ecosystem that can contribute and participate. And contribution could be anything from being a maintainer, for example, on one of our projects, projects to being a contributor in one of our special interest groups, like our supply chain special interest group, and others as well. So there's a lot of ways that you can participate and you can contribute as well. As I mentioned, blockchain, we've heard this over and over again, is really encompasses a lot of different resources and a lot of different ways to do it. And a lot of industries really focused on blockchain services. I mentioned this already, what makes it unique. We are part of the foundation, the Linux Foundation, and it's really creating a neutral and collaborative way for all those that want to participate and to deliver and to use, obviously, the code that the foundation hosts. Today, we are hundreds of different members. These are community members, our sponsors that help support the foundation, but over 40,000 contributors, 1.27 million contributions plus, that was last year's number, in the last 5 years. And really, we continue to grow our ecosystem of companies that are contributing code and solutions into the ecosystem as well. And our community continues to grow. We have multiple projects. The Hyperledger Foundation is an umbrella of multiple projects that we have, and you can see some of them here. And over the years, we've really developed our projects have come in and been contributed to the foundation based on what was happening and continues to happen in the ecosystem. Starting in 2015, that's when the foundation was formed, and in 2016, the main DLT projects that came in were Fabric, Sawtooth, and Iroha. And Fabric obviously continues to be one of the most adopted permission distributed ledger platforms. Last year, Blockdata did a presentation, a report where they highlighted that Fabric is still the preferred solution for 38% of the top 100 companies, as you see here. So continuously, our solutions are adopted across multiple use cases as global supply chains. We'll talk a bit about Circulor, other supply chains like Simba, which is tracking airplane parts for the government of the United States, and other use cases. And supply chain is obviously, from a blockchain perspective, really the blockchain enables that greater transparency and traceability to reduce risk of fraud and counterfeiting. And we'll get some more of that information when Circulor comes up. If you think about trade finance, we've had a lot of lessons learned, a lot of things that we've heard from the ecosystem. We also were discussing TradeLens, and there are new platforms like GSBN, which is Trade Finance 2.0. How do we take those learnings from previous examples and then incorporate them into new systems? We do have over 150 use cases that you can explore. Many of them are supply chain and trade finance use cases in our Airtable, and I'll put the link to the presentation in a second into the chat that you can click on and go explore as well. So as we continue to evolve, by 2017, we did start thinking about digital identity. John Lorenzo mentioned it being one of my key interests, and really building decentralized ecosystems, and digital identity is serving as a fundamental block. And we have projects like Indy, Aries, and AnonCreds that are really driving a lot of digital identity, not just for people, but for entities. For example, with the Energy Mines program that's coming out of the British Columbia government, and others as well worldwide, really driving digital identity in the decentralized ecosystem space. 2018, more tools, more libraries, things that make the enablement of blockchain in the enterprises really, really valuable. And there's also this move since early 2019 in the Hyperledger Foundation around the fact that it is not just about permission blockchains, that there is a spectrum of blockchains. There's not a one size fits all. And we're seeing a lot of great use cases, both in the permissioned and in the permissionless space using blockchain, as well as hybrid use cases. And there's a lot of great work that our community is working on. And this is all about how the markets are maturing and the use cases that people are enabling. An example is LatChain, based out in Latin America and funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, where they're using Hyperledger Besu, which is our EVM framework, to create generally a general purpose infrastructure for blockchain ecosystem. And there are supply chain use cases, there are sustainability use cases that are being built on LACchain as a public permissioned blockchain. So lots of great use cases. EBSI out of Europe, the European Blockchain System in Services, also using Hyperledger Besu in creating a public permission network for these use cases to be deployed. I saw on the chat, someone posted about our supply chain trade finance. We are a code project. We have these code projects, but we always have special interest groups that are focused for the SMEs, for the subject matter experts to come in and talk about the work that they've done, to share best practices, to come and do guest speakers, come and do presentations around the work that they are doing, to get feedback from the developer community and the subject matter experts. So in 2019, we launched our supply chain special interest group. And since then, it's been merged in 2022. And they have biweekly calls. And it is really a great way to participate in the community and have your voice heard and share those lessons learned that many of you I know have done as well. And they're currently working also on a supply chain ebook, so please do keep an eye out for that. 2020 was an interesting view when we start thinking about networks and how, especially in things like global trade networks, supply chain networks, financial markets, it is networks of networks. And many enterprises need to be in multiple blockchain networks in order to have their business be able to run. So we started thinking, the community started thinking about interoperability. And today, Hyperledger Cacti is a project that's focused on interoperability between blockchains and really addressing the blockchain DLT fragmentation, making sure that businesses can participate in multiple networks and assets can also be traded between these networks without a lot of reinventing the wheel as well. In 2020, we had our climate action and accounting special interest group launched, and that is another great place to really talk about sustainability and the practices that we see in the marketplace as well. So once again, I will make this deck available in 1 second. So as you can see, the history of Hyperledger really covers the way that the marketplace has been going. In 2021, we launched projects like Firefly and Bevel that are really about making sure that there's tools to very easily deploy and build networks and consortiums and other use cases that those might have. So this is an invitation for all of you to join the Hyperledger community. You can join a community call. You can join one of our projects and labs. There's a lot of great works, but the core is open source and open communities is really truly how we're going to build better, how we're going to learn lessons learned from the things that don't work, the failures, and really find new opportunities to collaborate. And going back to Marin's point around community and governance, these things are very important. And I truly believe that the way that open source, not just at the Hyperledger Foundation, but many open source communities work, is really has some key learnings that we can apply to traditional businesses, specifically when we're talking about use cases around sustainability and supply chain as well. But without our member communities, without the companies and the developers that support the ecosystem, we cannot do all the great work that we've been doing since 2015. So it is with great pleasure that I also want to introduce Circulor, who since 2018 has been a member of the Hyperledger Foundation and really shared a lot of the work and from a technical perspective, a governance and perspective, and I'm really looking forward to Doug's presentation as well.
Thank you, Daniela.
Great. Thanks, Daniela, for the presentation again. I think also this time, unfortunately, we don't have much time for questions right now. But again, just I'm going to save some time for the Q&A, for the final Q&A. So I'm just briefly introducing Doug. Well, first, the first thing that I would say is the full name. So Douglas Johnson-Poensgen, and is founder and CEO of Circulor, which is a platform using blockchain to improve the traceability of complex industrial supply chains, and he's gonna tell us a bit more about it in a moment. He has 25 years of international experience and quite diverse background, right? So he has held leadership position in large corporates such as Barclays Bank and BT, but he has also spent his early career in the military and management consulting firms as well. So that's it on my side. I'll hand it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Daniela, for the plug. Much appreciated. And I'm actually going to pick up on some of the themes that both Marin and Daniela spoke about and try and sort of bring them to life with a practical case study. So Circulor, founded in 2017, the particular use case that we started the business on was trying to track the provenance of cobalt in electric vehicle battery supply chains. Why? Because cobalt, as some of you I'm sure will know, is essential to lithium-ion batteries, which of course, core to the energy transition. But 65% of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with all sorts of concerns around human rights abuses, child labor, etc., etc. And we were looking for a specific use case where there was a real asymmetry of participants. At one end of the supply chain, you have car manufacturers. At the other end of the supply chain, you have artisanal miners. And in between, you have up to 7 steps of refining and processing of materials and the manufacturing of sub-components that become eventually things like electric vehicle batteries in cars. So, globally distributed, no trust at all between participants, an established problem that people are spending money on. Now, we've evolved since then to a point where, and some of you I know in Europe, you'll have heard perhaps of the recent adoption of the European battery regulations, which will require all batteries above a certain size within the next few years to have what's called a battery passport. And more generally, the European Union has been driving for digital product passports for a whole variety of different types of products, predominantly to drive both sustainability, greater recycling, and also to protect consumers' interests. Now, that theme of a digital product passport is coming to other parts of the world as well. China has just adopted a roadmap towards effectively battery passports as well. The US has passed last year the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides tax credits for a combination of responsible sourcing from free trade nations and made in America, which fundamentally is also a form of battery passport. Essentially, where's stuff come from? Where did it end up? And so there are themes that I'm going to unpack here that are not just unique to the automotive industry, although that's the example I'm going to talk about a bit more. So just to give you an idea, we are working with a whole host of brands. This is a very small selection now. You'll see a number of car manufacturers here. You'll see, you might recognize some of the upstream miners. BHP is the largest mining company in the world. SQM is one of the largest lithium producers in the world, and a whole variety of others. You'll notice oil majors here too. The reason why I've put the logo of one of the German government departments here is that we're the technology workstream lead for the German government battery pass project, which is unique because it is the first time a government anywhere in the world has tried to get a group of folks together in industry to equip themselves and develop what will be global best practice for how to try and bring to life a digital product passport. Now, I'm going to unpack this as we go and explain the role of blockchain. I'm going to pick on some of the themes that were brought up by Marin in terms of why a blockchain is a useful ingredient in the overall platform architecture. The question around governance and permissioned or non-permissioned, public or private, questions of interoperability. So I'm going to hopefully try and draw out these themes as we go. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and keep this so we actually have a bit of time for questions at the end. Now, the provenance of raw materials means that you have to be able to build a digital thread through a complex supply chain. And almost no supply chain is a series of one-to-one relationships between each of the participants. If you take something like the EV battery supply chain, where there are 10 principal ingredients, they all start as rock and they all end up as a car. You have big miners and small miners. You have processors and refiners. You have precursor manufacturers and then cathode manufacturers and battery cell manufacturers, et cetera, through a supply chain. And it's a whole series of many-to-many relationships. where those commercial relationships are built on a combination of today price and availability of material. And that means that even for the same type of battery going to exactly the same model of vehicle with the same car manufacturer, you could have multiple participants contributing through that supply chain different materials over time. So what you're essentially trying to do is create a digital twin for a physical commodity at its source, and build these digital threads that follow that flow of materials through these complex web of interactions. The amount of time between mine and car is probably 9 months. So what you need to be able to do is notarize and timestamp transactions so that you can be confident that history is not being rewritten if it subsequently proves to be inconvenient. So if you haven't responsibly sourced your cobalt, or your lithium comes with environmental concerns, then you can't rewrite history. And that's the value of a blockchain in the context of this platform. A distributed ledger is not a particularly efficient way to store very, very large amounts of data and process it efficiently. But what it is very good at is that notarization and timestamping piece. So we use a combination of Oracle database and graph database for the storage of information and the creation of business logic that describes, if you like, the chemistry at each of these steps. Because things like Oracle Apex are better at allowing you to describe that complex business logic, effectively coding the chemistry. And underneath it, you have a distributed ledger, and then using other tools for both the capture of information. We have both APIs as well as bulk upload data mechanisms for large volumes of data. For example, in the consumer electronics industry, the volumes of data are so big that that volume of structured data over an API, even when collected on a daily basis, is a little bit too much. So there's a whole variety of things in the platform architecture, but this is in my view, a near perfect use case for a distributed ledger. And we use Hyperledger Fabric, which was obviously just talked about. We're also actively looking at some of the other Hyperledger projects for the evolution of digital identity as best practices emerge. Now, imagine now you have a digital thread that describes the provenance of material. You can attach other information to that digital thread. What I'm interested in is the identity and attributes of the physical material and the identity and attributes of the actors along the supply chain that work on that material through the supply chain. And when I'm talking about the attributes of those actors, I'm interested, for example, in their scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions, because that's how you build a picture of inherited scope 3 emissions at the downstream, and I'll explain why in a second. Water use is the next frontier of ESG. Human rights I've already talked about. And so all of those ESG, environmental, social and governance factors are all attached to physical locations or facilities or organizations. And so you can start to connect material to the actors involved with them, which means that when, for example, you're a car manufacturer in Germany and you have to comply with the German supply chain law, which means you're responsible for what you've inherited from the supply chain, you have some means of being able to see it. Now, without going too nerdy on batteries, but this is relevant to us all if we care about the energy transition. Clearly, you've got rock that become things that roll, which is that horizontal line. And then, of course, that battery exists in a vehicle for a period of time until it is either recycled or remanufactured and reused or repurposed in an energy storage system, the circular economy, which of course is the circle on this diagram. It is impossible to create circular economy business models without having some way of knowing where an asset is, what its state of health is, and potentially who owns it and is financing it, etc., etc. And so this concept of distributed trust is as relevant to the circular economy as it is to the original supply chain that created, in this case, the electric vehicle battery. Now, I talked about carbon. The reason we're all shifting towards electric vehicles is because clearly internal combustion engines are very polluting when we burn diesel and petrol. The challenge, though, is that the shift to electric vehicles is not necessarily going to make the situation better. And that's not because of the tailpipe emissions from the use of the vehicle. It's because of the enormous amount of energy it takes to turn rock into battery-grade materials into batteries. And if that energy isn't renewable energy, then you're basically just swapping the pollution problem from the use of the car to the manufacturing of the car. And the EV battery accounts for half of all of the supply chain's contribution to the manufacturing of a vehicle. The supply chain's contribution is 80% of the total carbon emissions of manufacturing an electric vehicle. And you or I in Europe would probably have to drive our brand new electric vehicle for about 50,000 kilometers to have repaid the carbon cost of its manufacture. And it depends, of course, whether we're in Sweden or somewhere else, the level of renewable energy. So this is a core problem that industry is trying to solve, even as they're trying also to create digital product passports, which will become a license to operate for car manufacturers in Europe. Now, what can you get from this collection of information about either the physical material or the actors involved? Well, you can obviously see what's, forgive the screenshots are a bit small, but you can obviously see what's going on in your supply chain. I talked about those digital threads. The material traceability, second from the left, shows how those threads of material come together eventually into a car. And I've talked about the attribution of carbon emissions. It could be water, it could be all sorts of other environmental characteristics to that physical flow of materials, so that you, the downstream, the auto manufacturer, knows what it is that you inherited. And of course, when you aggregate that data up, you're able to start comparing across different manufacturers to be able to show, which are acting more sustainably all the way through the supply chain. One of the things that was touched on was a problem with the Maersk trade lens solution was neutrality. Circulor plays no role at all in any of these supply chains except for being the truth teller. We have no role at all except to collect information from supply chain participants and present it like this at the downstream, and also to help build digital product passports or battery passports for these materials. And the approach that we took from a governance perspective to this was different to some of the earlier generation of blockchain projects. IBM, for example, believed firmly in the idea of consortia. Now, the problem with a consortium is it has a significant governance overhead. It's fairly slow to make decisions. You've got to achieve consensus. I don't mean that in a blockchain sense. I mean that in a human sense, between multiple different organizations, all with different funding, et cetera, and it's painful. The approach we've taken is one of, if you like, a coalition. So our first major customer was Volvo Cars. Volvo Cars worked with us on the traceability of cobalt. The next major customer was Mercedes-Benz, that was interested in seeing if that chain of custody of materials, you could start to attach CO2 data to it. There's no relationship between Volvo and Mercedes-Benz, and there still isn't in our platform ecosystem, but they each benefit from the innovation that the others have brought to it. And that continues. And what we've now started to build is a sizable data network. We've got some 75 different organizations now providing battery traceability data, ranging from mines in the Congo all the way through to car manufacturers in North America. It's clearly not open to everybody to see everything. You only see what you're permissioned to see. But the innovation driven by each creates network effects for each of the others. Those data network effects are very important to the long-term success of an ecosystem, so that each additional supplier in the midstream that joins the platform brings an incremental benefit to others that also use that particular participant within their supply chain. So I've touched on a number of case studies, but conscious of the time and the desire for some questions, because I've already illustrated this, I'm actually going to stop here so that I can hand back to you, Lorenzo, so that we can have a conversation. I can go into more detail if it's useful in the question and answer session.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and being mindful of the time. So I think we can open up the discussion. So there are already some questions in the chat, but perhaps if someone has already one question for Doug, we can start from there. Otherwise, again, we have already something in the chat.
Forgive me, I didn't look at the chat questions, but if you want to pick on one or some, then we can, Daniela and I can have a go.
Sure. Well, if the audience is not yet already brave enough.
Sorry, I can ask all of my questions.
Sure,
Is it
perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I really loved it. It's really interesting. I have just one question, maybe Martin or the others can also give some ideas and reflect on that. And we have so many studies and discussion on how blockchain plays a significant role in improving trust between firms and the other customers specifically and other actors in supply chain. But as also Martin has mentioned that probably there are some kind of underlying features with blockchain which kind of actually diminishing the trust towards the other actors in supply chain. What are those features that undermining this trust aspect? And then when we talk that there are trust issues, is it just more concerning the complexity of the technology, privacy concerns, scalability, or the regulatory uncertainties? Can you be more specific on that? That would be great. Thank you so much.
Shall I kick off? Supply chain fraud is as old as mankind. We've been adulterating flour with ground stone since we, pretty much crawled out of caves. And supply chain fraud still happens today. About 3 or 4 months ago, Trafigura, one of the world's largest commodity traders, announced that they had lost 600 million in a nickel transaction because what arrived at the other end of the supply chain was rock. And that's a pretty sophisticated organization. And there are many other examples of this. So, and of course, fraud pays, and that's just one example. The question of trust in supply chains is nothing to do with technology. It's to do with a lack of transparency. And it's technology, particularly newer technologies like blockchain, that help to try and address, new technologies often address old problems. And I just said that supply chain fraud is an old problem. New technologies can help bring trust where there wasn't any before. So if I'm running a responsible artisanal mine site in the Congo, and that means that I'm paying my workers fairly and there's no kids on site and nobody's digging deep holes that collapse, etc., then I want to be able to get my material to market and have people be confident it actually came from where I claim that it has come from, which is separately audited to say that this is a responsible mine site, albeit that people are digging with picks and shovels. And that means you need reliable provenance. So it is an opportunity to use a technology to address a specific need relevant to a question of trust. Did this really come from where you're saying it came from? And that is just one little example. Now, clearly, when you're building a platform like ours, you need to build tools to identify anomalies where things are happening that are not as expected, where claims are made which are not real. For example, we use machine vision to look at activity at mine sites in certain parts of the world and compare that with claim production. In some cases where those licensed mine sites are in a what's seen as a safe jurisdiction bordering somewhere that is not seen as a safe jurisdiction and material is being smuggled across the border. And so if there's nobody working at a mine site but it's producing a large amount of material, I wonder why. So it's not just about blockchain, but when I have that data about an anomaly, it can't be changed. And that also helps build trust because you've got that notarization. I'm going to stop and let others speak.
Marin, do you want to add?
Yeah. Maybe just quickly. I think Doug covered pretty much what I had in mind. Maybe just conceptually to try to explain to you how I see this. So the problem is converted from organizational to technical level, right? And I think this is the power of blockchain. So if we have a problem, which is in relation to trust or security, we have inter-organizational problems, right? And then that problem with the blockchain are converted to technical problem, technical space, technical level, and resolved there. So I think the bigger issue is just the difficulties of governing ecosystem. Being blockchain based or not, I think this is the main issue overall. So the governance of ecosystem is difficult, and blockchain is nothing different, right? In that sense, however, the blockchain is not unhelping there. It's definitely helping with openness. With what Daniela said, the notion of neutrality and open source position. So I think we are just struggling with the governance of such complex platform ecosystems. And I think both academics and practitioners are trying to figure out how to do it in the B2B context, because it's a lot at stake. And in B2C context, we've seen a lot of easy fixes for the governance, how governance could be easily resolved. In B2B is much more complicated. So that's my reply.
We're a private permission system, which means that there's a minimum threshold of trust necessary to be allowed to participate and provide data. And there's a question about, isn't all blockchain trustless? Well, not necessarily is the short answer to that. And we could have a whole hour's conversation just on that question. It then talks about, is Circulor the custodian or maintainer of the blockchain network, and does the ecosystem of partners host their own fabric nodes? Some do, many don't. So many participants just say, I'm happy to participate. I'm happy to understand that this is something that others upstream and downstream of me also participate in and trust. And we have private channels, which is how data is shared between existing commercial relationship participants in a supply chain. But there are a few customers, some of the larger organizations that do host their own node, and they then receive a subset of that. Well, they receive all the data that is relevant to them, but not what they're not permissioned to see, which is to other manufacturers, for example. Again, that's something we could spend a lot more time on.
Yep. But I think it's a critical point, Doug and Marin, about the understanding that there are strict access policies and requirements to these systems in regards to who sees which data. And more, there's a lot of work happening in the blockchain ecosystem around more complex, data collaboration processes and exchanges. If you think about things that are happening with confidential computing or ZK, like there's a lot of work, academic work and implementation work to just really understand additional ways to share data in these types of networks. But ultimately, as Doug said, many of these platforms are built on permissioned blockchain frameworks that have very strict access policies for who could see which data and the results of the data as well. And that's built in, core into these systems. That's what they were built for.
Great. Actually, myself, I already have a few questions, but again, if someone from the audience has something to add to ask, I don't think so far have been other questions left unanswered. If so, speak up.
A question on chat about, does the fate of TradeLens for the future, what does it mean for the future of blockchain and supply chains? TradeLens was founded by Maersk, and to succeed in becoming a global platform, it needed its competitors to join too. And there was nervousness about providing data to a platform that was ultimately controlled and governed by an actor who might be one of your competitors, which is why the point was made by Marin earlier about neutrality, and why I made the point when I was talking about the fact that we play no role whatever in the supply chains that we contribute to. Marin, I'm sure you know a lot about this.
No, that's it. Yeah, 100%.
And I don't think blockchain of itself played any part in that at all.
No, I mean, you could see the number of startups, the blockchain-based startup like CargoX, like many Israeli startups as well that are doing amazing things with blockchain in the context of supply chain. So definitely the interest and application of blockchain supply chain, global supply chain is there. It's just the platform sponsor governance in this particular case was a good lesson learned for us going forward, how to approach such platform.
I mean, a very large technology company like IBM needs someone who's going to pay the bills. And so I understand why they would have gone to a large corporate to do it. Clearly, if you're a startup, you're funding yourself until you can attract venture capital investment, and you need that venture capital investment until you can start to generate revenue and obviously become profitable. It's a different commercial model which frees you from needing a large commercial sponsor.
We all just have to keep in mind that this is still very early on, right? Where we're seeing, amazing successes like the likes of Circulor and others, the use of technologies in these systems and these, global systems and infrastructure and partnerships is new, right? So, there are going to be lots of different ways that whether it's TradeLens or WeTrade, and others, the approaches many are early on, right? And we keep talking about the lessons learned, but even the technology, there's going to be changes, implementations. So when we talk to, both, consortiums or companies that are building platforms, is really also understanding the flexibility and how you deploy these things and how do you also architect them to a point that they can mature as the technology and as your needs mature. And things like interoperability that I mentioned before, right? These networks of networks can, speaking to one another. There's not going to be one DLT to rule them all. You have to build on this DLT. You have to build on this platform. So I think that's, an important aspect of it is if we think about this, we all, the blockchain industry, if you're in the blockchain industry, it feels like 1 week feels like 3 years sometimes. It sure does, because there's so much going on. But we just got to keep in mind, this is, relatively new tech that is being applied for systems that some have been in place for, 30, 40 years, running, billions of dollars of revenue through the global supply chain.
There's a question just come up on chat about, I'm curious to know thoughts on government or agencies such as the UN to act as trust anchors. Certainly in the space in which we operate, the role of regulators, policymakers, governments has been to try and create policy objectives. So the Green Deal in Europe has been the umbrella that things like battery regulations have stood under, which has required a degree of transparency and a common set of standards to start to be applied. And that has allowed room for innovation about how to prove that you're complying with these sorts of things in this case, global supply chains, where you've got enormous organizations and, individual artisanal miners, to take two extremes. And so, and I think certainly in the supply chain space, I don't see yet a role for the United Nations Agency of Supply Chain or whatever to somehow deal with this, because I suspect that by the time policymakers have put in place the framework of regulations and harmonization of standards across between China and Japan and Europe and et cetera, that actually there will be solutions already of scale that have been adopted, and the herd has moved towards solutions that do what they need to do to comply and demonstrate what they're doing.
Yeah. So maybe just another comment. I don't know if I'm replying to the question. It's a very similar thing like with the AI that we could observe these days. So if we have a technology domain, an application domain, right? So these two domains need to interact. We need to bridge like very deep understanding of the problem we want to solve, like cobalt, like a shipping industry, like some other. So that's an application domain, and then the technology is another domain that needs to kind of interact with the application domain. I think the application domain is much more complicated to unpack, and the technology is moving very fast at the same time. So I think bridging these two domains is what is necessary for the success of application. Yeah. So I see another comment by Martin. I
don't know, Martin. Okay. If
I could convince you that the technology was there. Yeah, I could definitely convince. Have a convincing arguments that technology was there. It was not only IBM marketing. Yeah, it was not, for sure.
Yeah, I think there was nothing wrong with the technology application of TradeLens either. we've obviously looked at it, and you know, I think what you've done was good. Subu has a question, I think.
Yeah, please go ahead, Subu. Yeah.
Oh, hi. I'm Subu from Innoflexion, based in San Jose, California. So I have a question, which is, you have this AI tools at the application level. We see that the generative AI and so many tools are being used, but the output of those applications in terms of decisions are stored in the blockchain, which creates trust. But AI applications cannot, I don't know whether to trust the AI applications fully or not. It's an ongoing debate. So the output of these applications are stored in the blockchain. So how do you marry the trust that blockchain creates with the output of the AI and generative AI applications?
Every technology platform has the same challenge of rubbish in, rubbish out. So you need to make sure before you put, I mean, it's all very well to have records that can't change, they're immutable, that's fantastic, but you have to be confident with the input data, whether it's generated by AI or comes from supply chain participants or anybody else. And so I don't think AI helps with that. I mean, we actually use machine learning, so obviously, you know, the underlying technology behind AI, to identify anomalies and to learn patterns within, you know, what's going on within supply chains that helps us look for additional anomalies, places where people are trying to break the rules. But that's something you can train and you can learn. I think the fundamental is, you know, good data needs to go into a distributed ledger, and then you can trust that the good data was believable.
Okay, but along those lines, is it possible to, is it a good idea to store the context of the application's decision making also in the blockchain, so that if you trace it back, you could point to someone or the application that makes the decision to take responsibility?
I'm not qualified to answer that. I'm sorry, I don't know.
So the applications make decisions based on some model, some context, etc. But the output of that application is stored in the blockchain. Is it also possible to store the context of how the decision is made by the application?
You could do.
So that you can trace back the responsibility that, okay, this application made a good decision, this application made a bad decision.
You don't need to store the underlying data, you just need to hash it to a blockchain. But yes, you could do that.
As the record.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you. I think you answered my question. It's basically garbage in, garbage out. So the responsibility of the application to provide or give responsibility.
If you want to know the provenance of something that came out of generative AI, then what you've described could be worthwhile. But you know, whether that makes it more trustworthy or not depends on the context.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I also may ask a question, who pays for data storage in a blockchain? So when you have a huge project for several years, lots of data points, who covers these costs? Thank you.
I can only speak for what we're doing, which is that almost all the data is stored in traditional databases. The cost of that storage is relatively modest. The GPU load is also modest, which means it's not expensive, because what we're doing is we're hashing blobs of data to the blockchain, and we use Hyperledger Fabric, so we're not paying, you know, gas or some other crypto for transaction volumes on the distributed ledger. Now, when you're serving customers, paying customers like auto manufacturers and cell manufacturers and miners and all the rest of it, then they're paying a subscription to access a platform like ours. And that covers obviously the cost of all of the things that are necessary to both build and maintain and operate a platform.
Right, thank you.
And I think there are a couple of questions, or perhaps one question and another comment. So yeah, how do you handle integration into ERP and IoT are there plugins for SAP or other systems?
Yeah. Sorry, forgive me. I'm doing all the talking, but please jump in, Marin, Daniela. All the data that we receive in the platform is coming directly from manufacturing execution systems or ERP platforms. And it's coming over API, most of it. I gave the example of bulk data upload in the consumer electronics industry because the volumes of data are much higher. But the whole point is that we've exposed APIs both in and out as the principal means of moving structured data between platforms in an agreed format, and that's agreed as part of the implementation process. Marin talked about implementation when he was speaking, as part of the implementation process of onboarding and implementing the connection into the platform by individual supply chain participants.
Anyone wants to add something?
Follow-on question on that. So the individual participants choose what data they want to put on the blockchain, or is there a kind of a setup or a standard data format that you suggest?
In the context of critical minerals, the data that is necessary is well understood. Because ultimately it's all aggregated up into what will eventually be battery passports, the requirements for which have been set by regulators. And so the contribution of data from participants in the supply chain is something that isn't negotiable. And if suppliers, we find this now, some midstream participants don't want to play, but then they find themselves excluded from the supply chains that would eventually find materials coming into, for example, Europe. A similar thing will apply in the US under the Inflation Reduction Act, where, for example, you can't have Russian nickel coming in because of sanctions. So, if you don't want to play, or you're in the wrong place, or you're not prepared to declare where you're getting something from, you'll find yourself excluded from the supply chain. Now, that's not universal, clearly, but in the context that I've described, it's becoming a fact of life.
So if I have a core set of data that the system is expecting, and I have supplementary information, are you allowing the participants to put that in an off-chain?
Yes. Yeah, so audit reports, for example, certifications, all sorts of things can be added to the core information about actors or materials.
And that's customizable for the participants?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
If I may ask, how many participants are on the network today?
Today, about 250 different facilities in the EV battery supply chain. They don't all belong to individual entities. Some entities, very large battery manufacturers like CATL have clearly got a lot of facilities in lots of places.
Do you have any functionality for the battery warranty angle, or it's just primarily?
Yeah, well, and there's an overlap between warranty management and the maintenance of a battery passport. And some car manufacturers are starting to look at the idea of a digital product passport for the car as a whole, particularly for safety critical components. So you can address questions like into which vehicles did this particular batch of faulty widgets go, and therefore which 500 cars do I remove from the market in order to deal with the safety recall, rather than calling in 20,000 cars.
So if I may, on a technical level, I don't know how Circulor is implementing this, but there are events. So TradeLens was working with events. So the more events you have, you could think about better, utilizing these events in a better way. So this is the data point.
We don't call them events, but exactly the same principle.
Yeah.
Perhaps we have time for one last question. So how do you see the role of the Digital Container Shipping Association and the standards they publish in the adoption of blockchain in supply chain management? Who would like to take it?
I could take it. Major. I've been part of that association. They're doing an amazing job. They're pushing actually the the ground zero for everybody. So I think that they're putting a lot of work into standardizing the interfaces, and if I go back to the notion of a technology domain and application domain, so in the technology domain we have a Hyperledger, we have open standards, so this is kind of already resolved, standardization is there. But on the application domain, you have so many different standards and file formats in the shipping industry that is just not allowing progress. So that's their role, to standardize the interfaces, and so we could leverage the technology in the best possible way. And I think it's progressing quite well. I think they achieved the critical mass, and I think now all major ocean carriers are aligned with the standard that they are developing.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Obviously, open source code always has to, the standards and implementations. And a lot of these systems, it is the data modeling that needs to be done, and the specifications across the industry and the companies and countries, very importantly as well, especially in supply chain. So groups like the CSA and others are really needed in order for the code to be implemented and usable.
Great. I think that's was enough as an answer. Hope so, at least. And well, with that, I would say that we are done. So thanks, Marin, Daniela, and Doug, and all the audience for the lively discussion. I would say I hope that we were able to offer you overview, both theoretical and practical, on how blockchain can be implemented, at least in supply chain, and what are the challenges and what are the possible solutions in the implementation. So that's it. Thanks again, and hope you have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you, everyone.